and produced a lot of those propaganda narratives that allow Russians currently to perpetrate crimes against Ukrainians. And probably Maksym will tell us in better detail about this study, how the materials were gathered, and so on. We are about to proceed to Maksym shortly, and let me ask you how many such narratives you were able to identify during your work. Well, for every person mentioned in this submission, we indicate 5 to 7 key narratives that they were promoting. For some of them, it's the number, this figure is bigger. For some of them, it's smaller, but all of them contain calls to violence. And among the generalized narratives, there are 2 or 3 which accompany them all the time, and then there is a set of statements or quotations that are being repeated in their TV shows or spread and disseminated otherwise. Well, just to understand the frequency of such narratives, what is it about eradication of Ukrainians? Is it daily, weekly? Just for our understanding. Well, look, for example, Solovyov, he's got his set of shows. In every show of his, he mentioned the full set of statements. Or, for example, every evening, his shows change. Or, for example, Medvedev, he doesn't have any TV show, but he has Twitter or other means using which he was broadcasting those propaganda messages. Or Gromov, for example, he was not doing it by himself, but he was disseminating that propaganda through mass media so that people get used to it again and again. It's not like it was, the statement was made once, but it's like on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and it goes through television and internet media, so through the whole network of information dissemination. We were studying the information space in different aspects. For example, Simonyan is responsible for Russia Today, that has a global broadcasting network, a global hate speech campaign that they spread all around the world. Mr. Maksym, I hope you're with us. Can you hear and see us? If so, let's talk about the techniques used for this case submission. Thank you. We can hear you. Well, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude and appreciation of this submission. That's really important, and I hope this will launch the mechanism for the propagandists to be held accountable for inciting the violence. And I really appreciate the fact that you've invited the Archive of War, Mr. Ilyia. It's very important for our team and for me personally. Let me tell you just a couple of words about what War Archive is. We're a relatively new organization that represents non-commercial partner information platform that disseminates materials about the war in Ukraine. We get these materials as facts coming from the witnesses of the war crimes, and we also collect a lot of materials from the open sources. Reports, summaries, surveys, materials from the social networks that include also the materials coming from the Russian side, and that's the part of archive that was prepared during this survey. We were able to collect more than 7,000 different materials transcribed and collected within one tool that helped us to find specific statements in this large massive of information. And I think that it's probably let me comment on what Anna has said. I think that this part of work can continue because one of the elements of those materials that we gather are the list of the incidents, the perpetrated crimes that can be compared with other materials in our archive that we collect from other sources, and thus some repetition patterns that exist in the studied propaganda materials, if they can be compared with the materials that we get from the witnesses of certain events that can be classified as war crimes, the materials related to location of the Russian troops can provide us with additional opportunities for further investigations and finding connection between propaganda statements and certain narratives and events that can unfold as a result of these kind of activities. Uh, thank you, Mr. Maksym. And I'm curious to whether there was any cooperation with our law enforcement system as you were preparing this submission. Well, no, the only thing I can mention is that there is a problem in Ukraine that Ukrainian legislation and criminal code, they don't recognize any crimes based on hatred. So we've analyzed what can be the criminal cases filed against those people in Ukrainian legal system. There are calls to infringement of territorial integrity, incitement of war, but you're not going to find anything about hate speech there. So for our law enforcement, it's something they don't pay significant attention to, unfortunately. In our opinion, it's a mistake. And why do we bring this submission to International Criminal Court? Because we think that it's one of this hate speech is one of the key reasons of this war, and it cannot be ignored. It should be studied in these crimes, and Ukrainian law enforcement system unfortunately doesn't want to do it at all. For example, there is no criminal case filed against Gromov at all in Ukraine. So it's a big question, how is Ukraine going to investigate those crimes, because we didn't take all of the propagandists, we've only picked those on top, those who manage this system, who control it. In fact, the network is way more branched, and I think that Ukrainian law enforcement system should work more closely with that, because it's not persecution of terrorists, of journalists as they describe it, and it has nothing to do with the freedom of speech. It's the hate speech, and as long as we have more than 1,000 proven cases when it became a reason for perpetrating more serious crimes, it cannot be just a subject of scientific study, but rather a subject of criminal cases, and hopefully Ukrainian law enforcement system will pay due attention to this problem shortly. And I would like to add that as I work with some specific criminal case, for example, when I know that there were some statements regarding torturings, for example, in our law enforcement agencies, there is a list of questions asked from the crime victims, and among those questions, unfortunately, there are no questions. It's happening for the second time today. And unfortunately, it contains no questions regarding any motivation, any hate speech. People are just not being asked anything about that. And then if an attorney doesn't ask them, it all remains beyond investigation, and there will be no way to establish legal connection between propaganda and the torturous actions. So it's very important to include such question on that list, even in case we don't have it with connected to our criminal code, but this question should be asked during interrogation, at least for the sake of protocol. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please join our conversation. Svetlana Tkachuk, Ukrinform. I'm having a question to Mr. Volodymyr. You've mentioned that you've picked only those from the top of the iceberg, and that said, are you going to expand this propaganda pool of propagandists whose cases should be submitted to ICC? Well, ICC, you know, it's a complementary institution. They act as an addition to national mechanisms, and usually what they do, they work with the top of the iceberg. So it's important for them to just have their attention drawn to this type of crimes, because in my opinion, who is supposed to investigate this type of crimes is the national law enforcement system. And to them we can provide information about broader network of propagandists. Maksym put it in diplomatic terms, but so that you understand, they gather and archive all those videos, all those statements from Russian information space. Even if Russians will try to clear the information space further on, because probably you remember this anti-Ukrainian propaganda started back in 2004 after the Orange Revolution, and it's very difficult to find any information about that, because a lot of information was removed from the information space, and the archive of war, they pull all that information from different sources, and they archive and preserve it so that it can be analyzed later. So there's a lot of materials collected, and more will be collected further on. But again, it requires pretty significant resources, and there was a large group of people who worked on this submission from a number of countries. And it's difficult, you know, to continue watching this propaganda without becoming insane, because you start understanding that it's somewhere in the verge of insanity. It's very clear for Ukrainians, but the paradox is that the foreign audience, they don't understand and see this Russian propaganda so clearly. Some of the things that are obvious to us, that are something look somewhat different to them. They don't understand what is Maidanuter or Banderevets. You know, this is some words that exist in our context, and it's very important to let them understand, to bring it to international levels, so the international audience understands this context of hate speech development, that for the decades Russia was developing those hate speech mechanisms, and everything is included. Their anti-American, anti-European messages, anti-homosexual propaganda. There's a couple of dozens of such patterns that were hyperbolized and intensified. Thank you. We have more questions on the floor.
What about Chris Sampson here, National Security Media? What about the charges available to some of the Westerners, the British, the Americans, like Jean-Marc Dugan, Graham Phillips, Patrick Lancaster, who run around participating in the lies, but more importantly, they've actually participated in interrogations as part of their campaign, which is something that doesn't happen here, for instance, when there are foreign fighters who are brought. What are the possibilities for charges against those Westerners? Дякую.
Хто готовий?
Well, I guess Ilyia may answer to this question in part, but I think that they are protected by the jurisdiction of a country where hate speech is persecuted by criminal code, and it's a matter of investigation whether their national law enforcement agencies, law enforcement systems of their home countries will be interested in investigating their participation in propaganda, because we've picked the key figures of Russian propaganda, those who, in our opinion, are responsible for creation and spreading of this propaganda. But I agree, I can name dozen more people in every country. For example, in Germany, there are people who picked up those propaganda messages and helped disseminating them. And if we watch Russia today, all around the world, they have multiple local speakers who were picking up that propaganda and helping disseminate those messages. And it's important for International Criminal Court to investigate it and to put it as a crime, because now it's presented as a freedom of speech, like they do nothing wrong, they're just expressing their opinion. So for us, I think this submission was an important step that demonstrates that it has nothing to do with the freedom of speech, or it's a freedom of speech that results in tens of thousands of crimes. We demonstrate the clear connection. Ilyia, if you have anything to add, please join us.
That our strategy was based on, first of all, the strategy of the prosecution of the International Criminal Court, which targets only the most serious offenders. And so we coupled that with the requirements, the legal elements of this crime, which require that those statements are of the most grave character, and those that we target hold positions of leadership and have a wide reach. And so that's why we selected such individuals as Solovyov, as Simonyan, because their audiences are millions and millions of Russians. They have the capacity to shape their narratives themselves. They hold very senior positions either within the media sphere or are themselves agents of Russian Federation. They're state officials, and hence they wield a lot of influence about over the formation of that campaign of hatred. Now, I'm sure the individuals that that you asked about are important part of the dissemination of these hateful narratives. But in our estimation, and at this time, we selected those 6 individuals as the most responsible and the ones that require the most attention, the closest scrutiny by the International Criminal Court. But of course, it's not a closed list. We're always monitoring and looking for other potential suspects. And unfortunately, there are very many, because the machine of hatred that was created by Russian Federation is vast.
Дякую вам. У нас є ще питання.
Thank you. We have a little bit more questions. Good afternoon, Rosalana Bachai, Radio Svoboda. What is the probability of the investigation having started after your submission that would have more of a real component of investigation component rather than declarative, when we will be able to demonstrate to the public that all those things are real propaganda? Well, the submission to ICC as itself is a practical document because it contains information that the court needs for further activities. We provide the prosecutor with information. It's not like a public survey. It's a practical information for the prosecutors of International Criminal Court, who will further on analyze that information, and we hope that it will yield certain effect, specific actions taken by International Criminal Court. And we cannot still know what will be the effect. We cannot replace the court with ourselves, but in our opinion, this submission is absolutely reasonable and we expect it to yield positive results. Well, let me share my personal opinion. I really hope the chances are real serious, because this crime needs to be investigated, first of all, because within these 2 years only, they've said so much that it's definitely sufficient to have this crime investigated. It's more a matter of legal complications. For example, those persons are the citizens of Russian Federation. They do not commit that crime in the territory of Ukraine, and as it's known, Russian Federation is not a part of International Criminal Court, and we try to demonstrate the connection between their hate speech with the crimes perpetrated here in Ukraine. So there's a lot of legal aspects, a lot of legal questions that require answers, and if ICC agrees with all those small legal nuances, the investigation may become just as quick as it was in case of deportation of children, because there were direct statements. There was an order issued by the president that indicated clearly who committed which crime. So that crime was already proven by themselves publicly. So this case can push that prosecutor, who is a pretty brave prosecutor, who does brave things lately, and we hope that there will be a positive result in the end. Good afternoon. Oleg Moser, head of the Chief Investigation Department of the Security Service of Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were not invited to this event and we couldn't help but showing up. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Well, first of all, it's a very interesting story, because one of the criminal cases that the department is working on is a propaganda case that investigates all of the top propagandists, including, as my colleague mentioned, Mr. Gromov. Well, it was mentioned that there is no investigation in his regards, so please be aware that there are notices of suspicion issued with regard to all of the propagandists, and I cannot agree that it's difficult to prove the connection between their hate speech and direct threats, because the Russians, you know, in the beginning, from the year 2014, we were thinking they're stupid, and from the year 22 we were thinking they are even more stupid, but it's unfortunately not so. Their rhetoric is so cleverly built that to get the proof we need to investigate them, and then we have to get the linguistic opinion. And in the majority of cases, the materials that we get verified by the linguistic experts, the experts do not conclude that those statements contain hate speech facts. I don't know what will be the response of ICC, but our legislation says that it's not really so easy. Well, talking about Gromov, we all understand that it's a top-level government official related to Russian propaganda, but it's a latent official, a person who makes no statements. There are no documents that would prove that he controls or manages that propaganda machine in any way. So I'm curious, I would like to ask my colleagues what exactly are the materials that they submit to ICC, and if you allow, probably you can get us familiarized with those materials. Maybe it will be useful for the prosecutor's general office. Well, thank you for being here. I think that you will find common ground and probably set up some cooperation. Well, right after this press conference, the text of the submission will be published. It cannot be fully disclosed because it contains some sensitive materials. on which a matter on which security and safety of certain persons depends, but it will be an open source document that will be disseminated on the website of Federation for Human Rights, and it will contain annotation of all of the sources, how it was analyzed. And I was saying that one of the problems of Ukrainian legislation is the wording. The Article 161 contemplates responsibility for intended incitement of national hostility, and the way it's solved in other jurisdictions, it's solved in a little bit different ways. So we have to talk legal language. So to say, we're open to such dialogue, and of course we are ready to share all of the materials in our possession with the law enforcement agencies, and we will only be happy to reinforce the national investigation system. Anna Железняк, Suspilne. I think it's more of a question to Mr. Maksym. Can you please tell us what are the most widespread narratives about Ukraine and Ukrainians? I mean, those expressed by those propagandists, maybe some quotations, something famous that you can tell us about. Thank you. I think Ilyia has a comment regarding the previous question. Mr. Ilyia, unfortunately, we cannot see you on the screen, but I hope our technical team is about to put you on the screen shortly.
No.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes, we were hearing.
To hear me, I just wanted to respond to the previous question, and I think my colleague Volodymyr already alluded to this, but the crimes under, and of course we very much commend the efforts of the local investigative authorities and prosecutorial authorities to prosecute the crimes of propagandists. We thought that our efforts would be complementary, because the Ukrainian Penal Code currently does not criminalize crimes against humanity and crime against humanity of persecution such as hate speech. And as a consequence, it is impossible for Ukraine to prosecute that specific crime. And it is a different crime, although related, but it's a different crime than, say, incitement to genocide, propaganda of aggression, or propaganda of violation of territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. And so it requires a proof of discriminatory intent, but it doesn't necessarily require the hate speech to be connected with the subsequent illegal act, such as torture or murder. It should be somehow related to it, but there is not a need to prove a causal connection. And so in that sense, and for several other legal reasons, it is not the same crime, and somehow a little bit also easier to prove. So we would be, and with respect to Alexey Gromov himself, we argued that he is not a direct perpetrator of the crime. In other words, he is not making the statements, but by virtue of the control that he exercises over the propaganda machine, we think that he should be responsible for the commission of that crime as a superior, because he failed to prevent the dissemination of these statements. Or otherwise, we're also alleging that he ordered the dissemination of the statements. So those are some of the available avenues of imposing responsibility on perpetrators under the ICC, which I'm not sure if they exist under the Ukrainian Penal Code. So, and we will be happy to discuss potential modes of cooperation, including perhaps sharing some of the confidential materials that we do not publicly reveal in connection with this communication.
Дякую, Ілля. Повертаємося до пана Максима.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ilyia. Let's get back to Mr. Maksym. Mr. Maksym, so can you please answer the latest question of our journalist? Well, talking about the biggest, the most popular narratives disseminated by the Russians, it's very difficult to say whether they are a part of the most modern discourse, but the most influential messages are the illegality of Ukrainian government and the fact that Ukraine is losing due to the lack of resources and failure of the partners to provide the weapons. And those narratives keep changing all the time on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's important to view them under this angle where they can be seen as a systemic influence on Ukrainian society from inside, and the capabilities of the Russians to conduct further armed aggression. I don't think that I can give you the exact examples of the most significant statements from the legal point of view, but it's a process that requires close attention all the time. Thank you very much. Hopefully we've answered your question. Well, friends, thank you very much for this submission that was prepared by an extensive team. Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, during the war, we see that propagandists really play a significant role in this war. So hopefully this submission will become a step on a path to bringing the perpetrators, the propagandists, to accountability. And today I would like to congratulate all of the journalists with their professional day. Thank you very much. Let's continue working together.